So we are going to continue exploring the digital world, and Christina Hoffman, who is the global head of Medscape Medical Affairs, is going to talk to us about the work that they do, which enables us to share these KOL insights across a world that is now largely digitally linked up and forming communities. So over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Liz. Appreciate it. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So my talk today is called KOL Insights in a Digital World, and I think the premise here is that we should have some discussion. I'll use the presentation here, 20 minutes maybe, as a baseline for that, and then I hope that we can have discussion on the other side of that that presentation. So my goal for today is challenge some of your traditional thinking about defining a key opinion leader, explore diffusion theory as in terms of the context of scientific exchange, appreciate new ways to measure KOLness. I now find that we can make anything a noun and verb and adverb, so we're going to say KOLness here. Share a digitally informed KOL template. All right, so the questions that I'm going to ask you to answer right now in your mind, and then perhaps on the other side of it, we'll have some dialogue about that. So first, it seems like a silly question, I suppose, but think about how you would answer this. Why do we care what KOLs think? Who is a KOL and how do we find them? And what's the best way and where to engage KOLs in scientific exchange? So, as I say, we'll come back to that. I don't know how many of you happen to know Everett Rogers, but in 1962, he's an American psychologist, by the way, and in 1962 developed this diffusion of innovation social science theory. Now, you may not know him, you may not even know the construct of diffusion of innovation, but I'm sure you know the way that the bell curve of adoption, which we hear about and talk about, almost ubiquitously in the field, early adopters through laggards, right? So that is where this whole construct came from. And in 1962, and you think, oh my goodness, certainly we've advanced. Well, there's tenets and principles about this theory and that I think that we can all appreciate as true north in many ways. But what wasn't happening in 1962, or even until probably 10 or 15 years later, is the construct of the way in which diffusion of innovation can happen. And so, and we are thinking about diffusion of innovation, thinking about scientific innovation and understanding here. In fact, so if you were to say 1962, or even up to, as I say, about 10 or 15 years ago, what's a social channel? The answer might be, it's what happens when you put your boat in the water and you have a party on it, right? So now that's a very different story. And this is the then Influence Cascade, very much a trickle down. We all recognize this as the pyramid with a international key opinion leader at the top. We have the national opinion leaders that follow that, and then local opinion leaders are at the base of that pyramid. The arrow down simply suggests a trickle down cascade of thought, and that is how when Everett was thinking about these things, he was thinking about these things, but in reality, things have changed a little bit here. Not how, but the direction, if you will, of how these things are happening. And with bringing the social aspect into the space that we are working in, we're no longer thinking exclusively of trickle down. We're now actually thinking bidirectionality. So the bottom can influence the top can influence the bottom directly, the middle, and so forth. I mean, it really is a spaghetti bowl out there. So, and I know that Luca Desani is going to follow me. We're going to talk a little bit more about social there. So I'm looking forward to how we'll connect our two thoughts and presentations here. But social is absolutely changed the influence cascade. Now, I do want to unpack this slide for you because I think there's so much here that is very cool. And so first, some context. Clarivate, which was formerly DRG, which is formerly Manhattan Research, has issued Taking the Pulse, which is a syndicated research study in its 17th year. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but I know since I've been at Medscape, which is 14 years, I've been watching Taking the Pulse. So it really is a very nice way to see the trends that are happening. In this particular, the ends on this are 3,800. 2,000 of them are from the US, roughly 1,000 are from the EU, and then the remaining roughly 1,000 or 800 are from some other countries, making up just a very nice piece. But when you cut individual pieces and markets out, these trends still hold. So there's comfort there. Look at the x-axis. X-axis is monthly reach. Y-axis, I really want you to think about this, influence on clinical decisions. Go back to our cascade theory and think about that. You see the bubble color, it matters. Purple is what pharma influences directly. We've got offline and online bubble colors here. So what I want to point out here in this little area, this actually answers one of those questions, by the way, is where do we go to engage? But in this case, where I've just pointed are colleagues in-person conversations. We see it happens pretty regularly, and it has a high influence on clinical decision making. Very similarly, but still within our 2x2 upper right grid, is a remote connection. But it isn't quite as powerful as when they see each other and talk to each other in person or on the phone directly, right? So what I'm looking at here is let's take that and explore the ways in which they can connect and talk. And certainly they collaborate on projects. They have in-person meetings. We discussed that. They're reading their peer-generated content, texting, phone, and then social. As I said, I think social has added a dimension to KOLness that we need to think about. And you hear terms DOL or digital opinion leader, which I'm not opposed to in any way, but influence is influence, and whether they happen to be a digital KOL or not a digital KOL, and I think increasingly as time marches on, a KOL will be a KOL and digital will be a big aspect of their work. I think we're in maybe a transitional phase right now in that we actually do have some KOLs that are not digital opinion leaders. As I say, I think that's a transient place, and I'll maybe Luca can respond to that in his presentation. What you are seeing here is I'm going to show you a series of bubble graphs talking about social and harnessing social to define our KOLs. This is actually these series of bubble graphs that you're going to see here are coming out of the American Psychological Association meeting this year. These are real, and in this case, this is helping us harness through social listening what is happening in the social space for us. So this happens to be a network analysis, and what you'll see here are directionality matters, and thickness matters, and bubble size matters. So all of those things that speak to volume and direction of how things are going and how they went this year at the APA. Now, this is where we really start to unpack a little bit more of who's social nodes that we want to be thinking about. So in this case, the American Psychiatric Association has its own social node. Geopsychiatry had a social node. And then you start to see people popping out in there. And the color matters because the color is the node and how it's communicated. And communications arrows also still are going back and forth, and they still apply here. Influencers, this is an example. As I said, it's real. These are influencers at the APA, and you see their mentions and some key points about who they are and what's going on in their world. There are organizations. KOLness, of course, isn't just about people. Association societies influence diffusion of innovation as well. I will note that Medscape Psychiatry is in here too. Just a little plug while we're at it. And then some of the trending terms that are happening here, and some people that are making things happen. And so ultimately, this is data that we can harness to help us define KOLness. And if we think about now, how do we generate this complete, comprehensive thought leader profile? I'm saying to you that what we have are some of the things we've had for years, right? Randomized clinical study PI-ness, again, society leadership, publications, university credentials, guideline committees, social listening I've made the case for, and now I'm going to make the case for Bubble Up nomination. I'll say this, you are only a leader if there are people that are following you. I mean, again, that's like the blinding obvious, isn't it? But in reality, if we don't add in the bubble up aspect to this, we are a little bit blind to that information. So we have social listening can help with bubble up, but I am going to say to you, I believe that we really can get a little bit deeper here, and we can talk about the kind of relationships that people who are treating patients are having with KOLs, or what we would consider KOLs. So if we look at this, our little cascade here, I'm going to suggest to you that there are two categories. There is a category of peer-to-peer, or who do I trust as a sounding board? They are typically part of their practice nodes, right? They may or may not be in a social node together, but they are a practice node of thoughtfulness. And just think about how you might just approach this. So this is a question that we ask and we survey Medscape members. Among your physician colleagues, who do you know and trust? Listing individuals that you would interact with and feel comfortable discussing the clinical management and treatment of patients diagnosed with fill in the blank, right? And this actually gets at, who do you pick up the phone to and say, hey, I've got this patient, what do you think, right? Peer-to-peer, local. And when we get this information, who cares about that? How does it matter to them? Well, this actually helps inform MSL targets, because this is very often, if we're looking at our local folks, and it will give us even national input, or who's actually really community of practice or practice node, if I'm thinking about that in Minneapolis, right? Who's the center of that practice node? And that actually helps a great deal. And that, I will say to you, is likely a medical science liaison or field medical target. Now, as we build this next piece, who do you admire and respect as a thought leader? So that's getting us really to the top of the pyramid again. And here's a question for that. For difficult to manage patients, or when you need expert advice on a new product or procedure, list the physicians with whom you rely upon for expert guidance related to the treatment of, right? And so this is actually getting ultimately to people that I will say to you that the medical affairs executive branch, if you will, should be thinking about and talking to these people, because they are influencing pretty extensively. All right, let's go now to applying our lessons. How does this all play out? And this is just simply a KOL profile that assumes some things here, but I'm adding from our traditional KOL definition some of the information that we discussed just here. I'm adding the social media connections and suggesting to you that you think about scoring a person's KOLness on their presence, as well as a bubble up score, which is a trust score or an admire and respect score, and then have some depiction of a social node. So that ultimately gets us to what I'm going to say is really being able to harness the influence cascade, understanding that it is no longer trickled down, but it is bidirectional, and how we should be thinking about things. So I'm going to go here to answer, at least from my perspective, some of the questions I think that we put forward, and then we'll pivot, Liz, right after these questions and my proposed answers, and challenge the audience to push back or change or react to these questions if that's all right with you. So why do we care what KOLs think? First, I say to you, it's the engine of scientific advancement, because influencing the diffusion of innovation, finding out who's doing that, will actually change science and change medicine for the better. Who is a KOL and how do we find them? Well, someone that treaters identify as influencing their scientific thought and clinical decision making is I think ultimately the right answer. How do we find them? It's a mixture of some of the traditional aspects that we think about profiling for KOLs. It's adding a social aspect and then adding a bubble up aspect to it to get really a full picture of who we're dealing with and what we're talking about. And then what is the best way and where to engage KOLs in scientific exchange? And I actually want to go back to, and this is one of those answers where you say, no, that's incredibly insightful, isn't it? Go where they are or where they want to be. And what I will say to you, and I know we have all been in this place right now where congresses are hybrid, congresses are fully remote, congresses are live. And I will I'll put it out there, and then Liz, I'll turn it back over to you for questions. Is I think we are going to get to a place. I think we all hope for this pretty soon, where we will have the majority of our congresses will be live when COVID is endemic, and I think that there is a future state for that, and people are going to feel comfortable. I don't think they're ever going to fully go back in 100% to live in the ways that we had it. So we have to think about those things differently. But KOLs are obviously there, and having face-to-face interactions with them. And influencing, going back to Maya's comment about when she was coaching and mentoring an MSL, how those interactions are best done live if they can be. Now, that may not be what KOLs want. They may prefer, because it's a whole lot more convenient for them if it's just virtual, but they are more impactful when they're in person versus just virtual. So go where they are or where they want to be. So Liz, that's what I have here today. I'm hoping it's thought-provoking for the audience.
Thank you, Chris. I think it has been, well, thought-provoking and also informative in terms of understanding how these reputational elements build. Before we go to the audience, I actually have a question for you. Can anybody afford not to be digital these days?
In the cardiology space, which is where I've spent a lot of time, I think Eugene Brunwald can. But other than that, no. I mean, I think you're right. That's your question is really a statement. I think in many ways is they can't. And I think there's actually an opportunity here for the industry to help those that aren't to become better at it. I think if we think about what to call them, a boot camp on how to be social. I think especially as the clinicians that are less comfortable with it, and we shouldn't assume just because they're older, they're less comfortable, because that's not a one-to-one ratio. Certainly as a majority versus those that are comfortable, when it's, when you're a digital native, it's a lot easier to be social. When you are, not a native to digital, it does take some adaptation, but clinicians have been learning how to do different things their entire career. So I think they have to be, but we might be able to help them be better at it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. Again, going to the patient community, I know there's quite a lot of material out there in terms of peer-to-peer support in that respect. I wonder in the medical community whether there are some people that think it's all going to revert to normal and are kind of holding their breath. And I certainly think that there is a role for some training and support around social media. I'll be really interested to hear anybody else's views about that, or any questions for you, Chris, about other elements of your presentation, or indeed these three questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, unmute yourself, wave. say something in the chat.
Gesture in some way.
Yeah, jazz hands or something.
We're ready for you.
Hi, Jennifer. Did you just move and you've suddenly been jumped on, or do you have a question?
I do have a question. So we've been doing this pretty heavy right now, just identifying the key opinion leaders. We call them KOLs versus, we also call them KMEs. Yeah, it's a process, right? So we're using different platforms. We're using Monocle. We're using different, groups that can help us take this data and make sense of it. And but really, I think we're really starting to look into segmentation. So is this something that, so is segmentation kind of similar in nature to this traditional versus social versus the bubble up, or are we defining segmentation differently, or kind of?
I think, Jennifer, I think we're all in looking at the same thing, maybe from just a little bit of a different angle. I think there's a number of really good tools out there that help us just think and see things differently. I know we just had Tim up here for Within 3, and they have a really nice select. I think select is the thing that I've seen, and I was really impressed with some of the information coming from that as well. And then then getting that data and being able to use it, right? Because that's the first part is identifying, right? And the second is then how do we take it and make it useful? Do you have Viva? Do you upload all this stuff into Viva? I don't, I know there's other tools, but I am aware of Viva as a tool. So segmentation is very much, I think, the same thing as what we are really looking at here. It's all identifying people that are influencing thought and practice.
And do you think this segmentation, or this kind of creating these groups, that helps us create strategy around it when we go out in the field for KOL engagement?
I think it does. Obviously, the more you can unpack or understand about the individuals, but I would say to you, MSL to KOL or KME, a one-to-one, they're going to have some conversations. They're going to understand what that is. But how do you in the field medical and or larger med affairs space take those themes and get insights about trends that you then can create resources to help to address, right? Because if let's just make it up for right now. You've got, your MSLs are going and they're all talking to their KOLs or KMEs, and there's this sort of we're missing information on translating a guideline. Let's say that's the case. What could then pharma and or biotech come up with to help solve that problem, right? Might there be some either it's education or training, but might there also be some point of care tool that they could help to generate? I think it just helps to make sure that the team has the resources to help the people meet their needs.
Makes sense. Thank you.
You bet.
May I ask a question?
You may.
Yes, I thought that was really fascinating and very thought-provoking, and I have the privilege of working with Chris. Chris, the diffusion of innovation theory is something I'm not very familiar with, but might it not also be something that we could offer to companies as part of the medical affairs programs to help them identify the right key opinion leaders? Because in a changing landscape where it's bidirectional and things are bubbling up, and there are so many different influences on a particular situation and bringing a drug to market, wouldn't that be a wonderful way of more deeply engaging the pharma companies by helping them to really identify the right KOLs for the programs and working with them that way?
Yeah, ultimately, Joy, that's I think where we all land is the need to improve and to advance medicine is actually on the back of diffusion with key opinion leaders. So that's the very basic basis of how it happens, because treaters ultimately trust people that are practicing and that understand what's going on. And so it's at the very heart of it, for sure.
Thank you.
Anyone else with a question for Chris? I'm interested to know, with my patient engagement curiosity, the extent to which you're seeing boundaries being crossed in this arena.
So Liz, speak specifically about in terms of how patient advocacy groups are impacting, or just in general?
Well, individual patients as well. So we know that particularly with social media, a lot of patients, and particularly with Twitter, a lot of patients see that as an opportunity for direct communication with health professionals.
Yes.
And I would imagine, and there are also increasingly opportunities for patients to become involved with publications and so on. So I would expect to see that voice starting to become more obvious on the map. I just wondered the extent to which you see that.
Yeah, and I think that's it's 100% accurate, and I think that is a very much a future state that we have. I think we have to try to figure out how do we best take advantage and not fall into there. I think will be potholes. They're not so much at the advocacy level, because I think patient advocacy groups are going to be ideal in here, and perhaps are even some of the groups that are influencing thought, generally speaking. But at the end of one patient, I think that there's that dance between I'm a clinician, here's my social presence, and a patient coming through that social presence to try to engage the clinician. I would imagine, and I know Hansa Bargava, who works with us, has done some work on how do you create your social presence that is really intended to be patient facing, and how do you advocate and engage with patients in a way that is safe, helpful, but also not risky in that regard. So I think it is that dance at the clinician's level to how do I do this? How do I do this in a way that is meaningful, but then how do I get the very best of that? And how can I find those? I mean, I'm trying to think. Oh, I know. I was at a MAPS meeting, and there was a session about professional patients. And what it means is not one might think that doesn't sound exactly right, but it is a patient who has a disease or disorder or condition. They are just very public facing in that it's a patient influencer. I mean, we were just talking about, right?
Yes. No.
Right. So how do you work with a patient influencer in the manners that you're talking about there? So that's a different kind of KOLness, isn't it? Right. So we need a whole nother presentation on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where it's interesting to see how those patient influencers, as you call them, or expert patients or expert patient advocates, are looking to cross those boundaries. They're looking for opportunities to do that. And I would imagine that you're seeing that emerging on your radar.
Yes, indeed. And the boundaries and bumpers aren't, I think, fully in place for that yet. But I think as we explore that will happen just the same way that there won't be a KOL that doesn't have a digital presence. We'll have a strong understanding of how to best work with KOLs at the patient level KOLs.
Yeah, I think it will continue to evolve, and I think to some extent the people who are leading that field will start to lead by example, and people will follow them, as we've seen in many ways.
Best practices. Yeah.
Absolutely.